Alright, today is the day. Today is the day that I finally prepare my Fazbear Frights timeline. The timeline where I go through every single Fazbear Frights story and try to come up with a timeline for it that somewhat makes sense as to which story fits where. And it's going to be a nightmare for me, but hopefully entertaining for you. So here we go. But first,
only a small percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed. If you want to see more, consider subscribing.
it's free and you can always unsubscribe later. I want to say a couple things before I get to the timeline itself. First of all, I know this isn't going to be an accurate timeline completely. I'm not sure if a timeline was made for all of these stories to fit together. Some of them absolutely have a continuity since they're all connected through the Stitch Wraith, and one story happens after another, but some of them haven't been confirmed to be connected yet, so it's a bit harder to kind of figure out where they're placed. But I've come up with just some general ideas. Some I'm confident about, I'm sure I know where they fit. Others I'm not as sure about. Whether it's because we don't know if this takes place in its own timeline, in the game's timeline, the book's timeline. I feel like it's probably its own thing, but it's hard to tell for sure. So that kind of makes things a bit shaky, and some stories just really don't have much to go off of, or they have conflicting information that makes it a lot harder to place where they go exactly. But overall, I think I have a pretty good idea, and if there is a story that I'm not so sure about, I'll let you know, so just cut me some slack, okay? But I did want to, my goal here was just to make a timeline that makes sense, so let's see if I can do that. By the way, this timeline is going to be, like, super complicated, so if you haven't read all the Fazbear Frights books, please do so. I'm not going to do much in the way of explaining each and every one of them, because that would take forever. You're going to have read them, and you're going to have to remember them decently well, at least, like, the major plot points of it. So, if you're still pretty new to the series and haven't read all of it, don't watch this video, alright? Read them first, and I think you should, probably. They're really good. So the story that I think we kind of have to start out with is Coming Home, and the reason for that is because it takes place exactly 1 year after the missing children's incident. That makes it pretty much have to be the first story in the timeline. You might think some stories like The Man in Room 1280, people hate it when I call it that. 1280, people have been wanting me to call it, whatever. I'm going to call it 1280 just to annoy people. Some people have been saying that should be first. I don't think so, because there are some clues in there that hint at the fact that this has to take place later, and I'll get to that. But Coming Home is the first in the timeline because it takes place 1 year after the missing children's incident, and if this is indeed connected to the other stories, like the Stitch Wraith, that would mean it has to take place in 1986, since from Into the Pit we know that the missing children's incident is in 1985. So, off to a good start. The missing children's incident is 1985, as seen in Into the Pit, which itself takes place a little bit later, a couple decades, and Coming Home takes place 1 year after that. So, off to a good start. Next I do think has to be The Man in Room 1280, and that is because it kind of kickstarts everything. Unless there are some stories that aren't connected to the Stitch Wraith and aren't the result of the Stitch Wraith, and what happens in that story, I think they kind of all have to come after this, except for Coming Home, which you may argue that Coming Home has an antagonist, so it probably has to come from the Stitch Wraith. It has Chica. Chica shows up, and Chica attacks Susie and Samantha in that story. But I believe that that is not an actual animatronic. It seems to be more of a illusion, and I believe it's meant to symbolize how Susie every night goes to possess Chica. We know that they don't possess him during the day because Phone Guy tells us that they act normal during the day, but at midnight, Susie goes with Chica, presumably to Freddy's, and early in the morning she comes back. So it seems like it's meant to symbolize her going on to possess Chica at night. So it doesn't have to be connected to the Stitch Wraith because of that, and if it was, it would make this so much more confusing. This fits right in our second slot. But okay, moving on to the next one, Lonely Freddy. This one was a bit of a tricky one to figure out, because it's a bit hard to figure out where it places in this whole timeline, for actually quite a few reasons. Mostly just because we know Freddy's is open, and then it's kind of, we have to figure out whether it's open originally or whether it's a reopening, because those have happened before. That could be what's happening here, but we're not quite sure. I do think it is probably around the time when Freddy's was just open originally, probably sometime in the early 90s, before it closes by a few years, and shortly after the Man in Room 1280. It seems like the Lonely Freddy's are probably the result of the happenings in the Man in Room 1280, but they could also, I suppose, just be the result of one of Williams' crazy experiments. In the story, the Lonely Freddy's are revealed to be possessing tons of different children, it seems, so they could have been around for a while, which means either we have to give a lot of time in between the Man in Room 1280 and this story, or it's one of Williams' experiments, and then we can it's a lot easier to give it the time it needs for the Lonely Freddy's to capture all of these different children, as we see in the ending of the story. But the story is revealed to be connected to the Stitch Wraith, which means we can probably assume the Stitch Wraith is what causes these Lonely Freddy's to be evil. In actually the latest epilogue of Blackbird, we see the Foxy plush in this story, which is now in the possession of the Stitch Wraith. So it seems like this is connected to the Stitch Wraith, meaning it's likely not the result of William, doing some creepy remnant stuff in his workshop or whatever. So we'll put it roughly 2 years after the Man in Room 1280, we'll put it in 1994. Next is Dance With Me, and this one just really annoys me. Not only is it a story I just don't like, but it also it's hard to figure out where it fits in the timeline. Circus Babies is open, so I think we can probably assume it takes place early 2000s, because we know Circus Babies opened after Freddy's closed. Not sure how long after, we still don't know that to this day, but we'll go with early 2000s. That seems to make the most sense. There's not really any mention of modern technology being used in this story, neither in Lonely Freddy, which is one of the reasons that I think Lonely Freddy takes place so soon in the timeline. This one there isn't really any mention either, so we can probably assume, it isn't any weird, reopening of Circus Babies or anything. That happened with Freddy's. I don't think it's happened with Circus Babies. This seems to take place around when that was originally opened, so probably early 2000s. We'll go with 2006, just as a random number off the top of my head. And that's because we're getting to a point here where a lot of stories, as we progress here, it gets to the middle of our timeline. It's a lot harder to kind of figure out where things are going. So we kind of have to come up with a good estimate, but nothing more for this middle part of the timeline until the Stitch Wraith is introduced, and then we have a much more solid timeline. And then I think we'll put the stories that happen after Sister Location closes, which seem to be pretty soon after it closes. Room for One More, for one, because that takes place, actually, it seems to be very soon after Sister Location closes. There isn't really any sign of wear and tear on the inside of the facility Stanley works at, which seems to house the Sister Location robots. And then we'll put Count the Ways shortly afterwards, because then Funtime Freddy is gone, and he's in this random dude's workshop. So we'll take, 2 years after Room for One More for that one, for Funtime Freddy to somehow get out and actually escape somewhere. So we'll put Room for One More in 2009, and Count the Ways in 2011. Alright, we're almost through kind of this rough patch of our timeline. Let's talk about the ones that just they can kind of fit anywhere. So for those we have Blackbird, 1:35 a.m., Into the Pit, Fetch, The New Kid, and The Real Jake. Now I know that is a lot of stories, and most of these seem to fit kind of anywhere in the timeline after Freddy's originally closes, and during the time where people have just forgotten about it. At this point in time, it seems like no one really remembers it. There are some people, for instance, in Blackbird, some of the characters say that they remember Freddy's, but in other stories, that'll probably come a bit later, like Into the Pit. No one seems to remember it, except for, Oswald's dad. Whereas later in the timeline, people do remember Freddy's because it seems to be open as those stories take place. So these will take place a little before some of the later ones in this timeline. And we can kind of lump them all pretty much in the same area, since none of them really contradict with each other. They all kind of show, they all have examples of modern technology in them, so they can't take place any sooner than 2010. So I think we'll put them all roughly 2014, where the amount of stories really ramps up right before the Stitch Wraith is about to be created. So things are getting there's a lot going on, and then we're going to transition to the Stitch Wraith being created a couple of years later. Now I think is where our timeline becomes a lot more solid, because this is where the Stitch Wraith is first introduced. So let's start with Stitch Wraith 3. This is where it's actually created by the scientist Phineas. It would make sense for it to be created shortly after all of these stories happen. In basically the same period of time, he collects all the parts from them, he collects all the remnant or agony-infused objects, and he creates the Stitch Wraith. We'll give him a few years to collect everything he needs, so where those stories, I'll say, took place around 2014, this, I think we can say, would have to be probably after 2016. And then immediately after, when the Stitch Wraith kills Phineas, we get Stitch Wraith 4, which features Andrew and Jake, the kids in the Stitch Wraith, having their first real conversation, so it'll be like right after. Now we have another bit of a skip. We'll go another 2 years, and now I think we're basically in present day. So for the next ones, I'm going to assume they take place at the exact time the book they're in was written. So for To Be Beautiful, the next one in the timeline, we're going to say it takes place in 2019, since that's when the book that story was in came out. I really hope everyone's still with me here. We know To Be Beautiful is next because the next Stitch Wraith story mentions Sarah being dead, which happens in To Be Beautiful, so this has to take place right before that, meaning it's the next in our timeline. And we'll say it takes place in 2019, because that's just, it makes the most sense. What do you want from me? Then basically immediately after, we'll give it a couple of days, but that doesn't matter all that much, for the investigation to start surrounding Sarah and what happened to her. So also in 2019 is Stitch Wraith 1. Next is Out of Stock, which I think we'll say also takes place in 2019. See, the book it's in came out in 2020, but it seems to take... but it seems like this story actually takes place, like, immediately after Stitch Wraith 1. Maybe, like, a few months after at most, because the Stitch Wraith story it's connected to, Stitch Wraith 2, which takes place, like, right after the plush trap chaser is killed. We know it takes place around Halloween, we know this story takes place around Halloween, so we'll put To Be Beautiful in summer, and we'll put this one in autumn, around Halloween season. And all of this, putting it 2019, all of these stories, To Be Beautiful, Out of Stock, and the Stitch Wraith stories in 2019 helps give the Stitch Wraith some time to collect all the parts it's been collecting. We see it's been collecting a lot of stuff in the later Stitch Wraith stories, so it needs some time to actually collect that stuff. And that's why I'm putting this 2-year gap between 2017 and 2019, so we can kind of give it some time to actually collect the items it needs to. After Out of Stock and its Stitch Wraith story, Stitch Wraith 2, will probably come Step Closer and Bunny Call. I'm not sure whether to lump these in with the big chunk of stories we talked about before, or just to have them here, but I decided we'll put them here because it makes more sense. There's a lot of modern tech mentioned. Freddy's seems to be open again, whereas it wasn't in those stories, so we can't exactly lump them in at around the same time as those stories, because there was no Freddy's. It had been closed for years. So we'll put it a bit later, around the time the Stitch Wraith is collecting all these items. Next we'll put Stitch Wraith 5 and 6, and in these ones, we actually see all of the fruits of the Stitch Wraith's labor, so to speak, where it collects all these items, and it's about to actually get rid of them. And of course, in Stitch Wraith 6, it dies. William seems to come back in his whole mech thing, whatever that's about, and that's kind of where we left off for now. There are a few stories that I haven't talked about yet, and we'll get to those in a second, but for now, I think this kind of makes sense. I think these are the last in the timeline so far, and everything else kind of comes before it. And whatever happens after this could either confirm my timeline or completely deny parts of it. Maybe even the whole thing, I don't know. The 2 stories that I haven't talked about yet, In the Flesh and Hide and Seek, I think will go a bit later, and the reason for that is they seem to feature a lot of high tech, at least In the Flesh does. The VR technology in it is very high tech, even more so than the other stories here. Freddy's is open, Five Nights at Freddy's has actually started, so it has to be like after 2014, and it's a VR installment, meaning it's probably 2019 or later, but I think we'll probably give it a few years, because I don't want to make it before kind of where we're at now, IRL. If it takes place in 2019, that's a bit weird. We'll make it 2021, because there's a brand new FNAF installment inside of it, And I think it just kind of makes more sense to have that in the future, especially given how high-tech it is. As for hide and seek, the reason I put that not present day and a little bit later, go with 2022, is because in the story it's mentioned that the main character's brother, Connor, has worked at Freddy's for, I believe it was during high school. So that's probably going to be at least a few years, and now his brother's working there. So if Freddy's reopens around 2019-2020, which is kind of what we're going with, there needs to be a few years difference for Connor to have worked there for so long, and then for Toby to kind of take up his place. So we'll make it 2022 to give them a bit of time for Connor to work there for a few years, and then for Toby to take his place later on. But yeah, that's basically the whole thing. I hope you guys were able to follow along. I barely was. But that's kind of where we're at so far. That seems to be the Stitch Wraith timeline as we know it at the moment, and I'm pretty confident this is where we're at. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know your theories, and please let me know if I'm wrong. I want to be as close to right as possible with this. So if you have some plot holes to poke in my theory, go ahead and do so, because I would love to know. But yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.